We want to bring in Martin Gotham. He's a retired Black Hawk pilot and instructor. Martin, before we get to the Black Hawk incident, what do you think officials are looking at for this tragedy in Philadelphia involving this medical flight, this Learjet? It sounds like the flight was not in the air that long before it crashed. What does that tell you, and what will officials be looking for?
So, Christina, they probably had some sort of severe flight control malfunction in order to crash that shortly after takeoff. There wasn't any icing. Even losing an engine necessarily wouldn't cause that kind of rapid descent. So for some reason, whether it was striking birds or anything else, or just some sort of severe mechanical flight control malfunction, there's a reason it came out of the sky that fast.
I also want to ask you, given your experience, about the Black Hawk crash out near Reagan National Airport. Questions are mounting about whether the helicopter was flying too high, whether it was outside of its approved flight path at the time of the crash. Can you explain what role the altitude could have had in the tragedy? What are the sight lines from that helicopter? And is it the responsibility of the smaller, more maneuverable vehicle to stay out of the line of these jets that are landing, or does it depend on the situation and what the air traffic controllers are telling you?
So for a long time, these helicopters have been coming down the Potomac, and in that specific area, Christina, they're restricted to 200 feet and below. Now, when you're out there flying at night vision goggles, you're probably going to be right at the top of that altitude because you're trying to make sure that you don't get too close to the river, obviously. And it's worked for a long time. The fact that they would sequence a jet in for a visual approach to runway 33, right across the flight path of that Black Hawk, is really surprising to me. It appears that the tower had become complacent with allowing that to happen all the time, allowing the jets actually to even cross over the helicopters as they came down the Potomac. And in this case, it appears the Black Hawk may have been 150 feet high. And that's not a major altitude excursion. So the question that becomes from that is, if they were at 200 feet, would the CRJ have been passing over them at 150 feet? And that gets into the altitude not only of the Black Hawk, but also the CRJ, who, rather than flying a very precise instrument approach to runway 1, now was asked at the last minute to come around, circle around further to the east, and then come back in on a visual approach, where the altitudes are a little more discretionary with the pilot as they come into the runway on final approach.
When you get an incident like this, everybody on Twitter becomes an expert. But one of the things I was seeing from a couple different people who've flown Black Hawks is they were talking about the sight lines, and that you're not necessarily seeing what could be obvious to someone from far away because you're looking down at the water, you're looking at your instruments, whether you do or do not have on night vision goggles. Is it possible they didn't see this plane?
So the real reason that CRJ would have been extremely difficult to pick out is if they're under goggles, night vision goggles, and that works well for the water beneath you and in a low light area. The CRJ is coming from their left over all the city lights. And remember, they're at the same altitude. So to spot a CRJ, even with its landing light on, that's 90 degrees from you, coming left to right at your altitude under goggles is extremely difficult. In fact, pilots I've spoken to in that segment at night would usually flip their goggles up because the goggles can actually be a hindrance to your sight with all those lights being magnified under the night vision goggles.
Right. It's like somebody coming, at you with their brights on, on the highway. It kind of flares out everything. And I get it. It could be hard to see. I'm also wondering, can you explain to us a little bit about, we're very familiar with black boxes on airliners, but is the black box on the helicopter any different? And what do we expect to learn from it?
So just like the commercial jets, the Black Hawks had installed both cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders. So those will be able to provide the FAA from both aircraft the exact flight parameters, airspeeds, altitudes, everything else. But most importantly, in the cockpit voice recorder, what were the crews talking about? Was one of them on the map? Were they both looking out? And the Black Hawk has 2 crew chiefs in the back. They only had 1 on board. So a question I had is, which side was the crew chief on? Was he on the right side because they were coming down by Reagan International, or was he on the left side? So he would have had an extra pair of eyes out the left side of the aircraft looking for that CRJ. But the pilot acknowledged that he had the CRJ in sight, which clearly he did not. So with another aircraft being vectored, turning into runway 1, he probably saw that aircraft and mistook it for the aircraft that the tower was advising him to pass behind.
Just a terrible confluence of events. All right, Martin Gotham, thank you so much for joining us.